Hello and welcome to this Fastmarkets podcast on element number 5 in the periodic table, boron. With me I have market expert Jay Stolfi, who started out in metal fabrication, stainless steels, nickel alloys and aluminium, and 23 years ago founded Rose Mills Materials Processing in Connecticut, the only company in North America specializing in processing boron-based compounds. Thanks very much for joining us today.
Thank you, Caroline. Glad to be here.
And my name is Caroline Messecar, and I am Strategic Markets Editor for Technology Metals, covering rare earths, mineral sands, and our recently launched boric acid prices. Now, one of the first things you notice about boron is quite how broad the range of applications is, even for a specialty material. I have a list, and it's not definitive. Glass, fiberglass, ceramics, fertilizers, insecticides, detergents, cosmetics, adhesives, abrasives, refractory materials, flame retardants, rare earth neodymium iron boron permanent magnets, semiconductors, superconductors, solders, fiber optics, Geiger counters, nuclear control rods, rocket fuel igniters, and satellite propulsion systems. Why have we not heard more about boron?
Well, two things. First is the difference between boron and borate minerals, boron-rich minerals. Boron's the active ingredient. Why you may not have heard more about it is people conflate the two.
Okay, so what's the difference?
Most people have heard about borax, right? You know, everybody's grandmother probably has a little bit in their pantry, and borax is not as sexy as maybe some of those rare earths that everybody's talking about, critical minerals, neodymium and cobalt and all that cool stuff. Because people think of borax and they equate it with their grandmother's pantry or 150 years ago, mule teams hauling borax across the desert. But as you mentioned, it's as applicable today with all the cool new technology and the forward-facing items as any of those sexy rare earth minerals that you.
So what you're saying is it's just it's got a lot of old traditional uses and it's also got a lot of brand new ones.
Yeah, it's one of the few materials or few items in modern industrial history where typically what you have is an old technology gets phased out or an old material gets phased out and it gets replaced by something new. Horse-drawn carriages became, combustion automobiles, turn into who knows, fuel cells or EVs or whatever. Boron and borate minerals are interesting because the legacy older applications, cleaning supplies, glass, ceramics like you mentioned, insulation, flame retardants, are growing in demand, as are all these cool new technologies, EV batteries, neodymium magnets, and all the things that we're going to need on for the 21st century technologies that we have. So.
Okay, great. So where does this stuff come from? Where do we get boron from? Who are the suppliers?
Yep. These are mineral-based compounds. So two ways to answer this question. One is let's kind of talk about the difference between boron and borate-based minerals, and then we'll talk about where everything comes from. So the market often confuses the two. The vast majority of what is used commercially, industrially, technologically are boron-based minerals or refined borates, such as borax, boric acid, boric oxide, zinc borate, etc.
So they're like the big main building blocks of a lot of...
Correct. And the active ingredient, so to speak, in each of these is boron. So there's a bit of a hierarchy where something like a borax has a lower percentage of boron, 10 or 15, 17%, depending on the grade. And then you move up, let's say, to boric acid, which has more boron. Then you move up to boric oxide, and then into some of the specialty things like ammonium pentaborate and zinc borate. And there's a bit of a food chain where very often the boron content gives you the density and the robustness of the boron, whatever you're using the boron for. Antiseptic properties, nuclear absorbent properties, flame retardant properties, etc. And then you also go up the price structure with that. There's a pretty good correlation between the boron content and the price. You also do have boron, elemental boron, in the form of a crystalline or an amorphous boron that is very high priced relative to the other refined borates, and therefore it's used in much smaller quantities. But the refined boron, the elemental boron, is used in things like energetics, meaning things that go boom, like airbags and defense applications.
Okay, that's fascinating. So we've got this whole hierarchy, like a Christmas tree, and right at the top you have the really high purity applications.
Yeah, well, and very often in just parlance between market reports or industrial or even from fairly sophisticated buyers, those two terms are conflated, and sometimes they don't get the conversion right with tons or price or boron compound.
Okay.
All of these items, all of these things come from mined applications and refineries around the world.
Well, that's actually my next question, because no matter where you end up, everything starts in the ground. So who are the big suppliers? What's how broad is the supply base?
Well, the easiest way to think of it is there are two main players in the world. There's a quasi-government private concern out of Turkey. They have the biggest pile of rocks on the ground. They're sitting on the biggest pile of boron minerals. They have the biggest refining capacity, and the other close second would be a large Rio Tinto based concern in California. That's the traditional mule team that everybody knows about. Those two are essentially Coke and Pepsi, Boeing and Airbus, et cetera, Microsoft and Apple, probably contain about 80 to 85% of the global market between the two of them. That's a
pretty narrow base when this sort of looking at sort of diversifying.
Yeah, yep. Beyond that, you have another California company. You have a handful of small South American companies, one in Russia, and that's about it. So, the third place, fourth place, fifth place guy don't add up to the second place guy, and there is no 10th place guy. It's a relatively small number of producers and refiners pulling it out of a handful of commercially viable pockets in the ground, and it is dominated by the two main players.
I'm just curious, how does price feed into that with these two big players? I mean, we've launched boric acid prices. How volatile is the price?
Much less volatile than a lot of other commodities. It's not oil or natural gas or gold or some of the metals where it goes up by big percentages, down by big percentages. Carolyn, I think that question may be best answered. I would look at it slightly differently and say that the supply-demand situation has been roughly in balance for the 20-25 years that I've been in this industry. Meaning it's unlike, let's say, natural gas or oil, where if the price is really high, then natural gas or oil, they'll flip on a lot of these drilling rigs and wells and start to bring it to the market because the price is $100 a barrel, and it goes down to $50 a barrel, and they'll either turn off some production or store it, and wait for a better day, or et cetera, et cetera. That's not the case with the borates. The borate producers are more or less running at or near capacity, and everything that comes out of the ground is more or less sold in short order.
So that's almost like a just-in-time situation.
A little bit, yeah. I'm sure it's not as easily, it's a little bit oversimplified, but it's more or less like that. So you've had in the past decade or so a handful of supply disruptions where one of the major suppliers and even some of the minor suppliers will have some force majeure event, a mining incident, something happens at the mine, a collapse, weather issues, maybe geopolitical issues. You had some disruptions back during COVID when the price of container shipping and ocean shipping doubled, tripled, quadrupled, and that tightness caused a bit of a price fluctuation. But in either case, in any of those cases, it still didn't result in huge fluctuations the way you may be used to in other more widely known, widely publicized technical markets.
That's interesting. Why? What creates the stability in them?
Well, Well, again, I think the supply-demand situation, because it's so broad, micronutrients, boron's a micronutrient, so there's a lot of borate minerals that go into agriculture, building products. A lot of material in the U.S. and Europe and perhaps elsewhere is flame retardant by code. And because the borates are a fairly low toxicity, low regulatory, safe and healthy alternative compared to a lot of other products, they're spec'd into a lot of that. Like you mentioned, defense related now with EVs and all that. It's fairly broad. So if one market is down, maybe another market is up. So it's not necessarily one of those commodities that is highly, highly, highly dependent on automotive or building or defense or agriculture. So there seems to be a little bit of stability there. And, the act of getting it out of the ground and refining it is fairly long cycle. So no one's flipping on a switch and, adding 30% capacity or taking away 30% capacity at the flip of a switch. So both ends of the spectrum have been somewhat stabilizing to each other, the supply and the demand.
Okay. So what's the catch? It all sounds too easy.
Well,
what does the market worry about?
Yeah, here's what the market should worry about. I think we're starting to catch up to the, if you're going to look at your traditional XY axis, bar graph or line graph, and you would see supply and demand somewhat in balance, you would notice that demand is creeping up and somewhere in the foreseeable future, maybe by the end of this podcast, maybe next month, maybe by the end of 2025, I don't know, the demand is going to start to outpace supply, or at least catch up to it, where any market disruption will start to make more of an impact than maybe what did in the recent past.
And presumably you don't have a lot of inventories lying around from the sound of it.
No. They're the big producers obviously have a bit of a pipeline, and I'm sure there's always, thousands of tons of something sitting somewhere, but it's mostly spoken for. So, how do we know that? How do I know that? How does Rose Mill Company know that? So just a bit of an explanation. Our purpose in life is to process borate minerals. And because of that, we purchase and supply services to all those big producing companies around the world. So we deal with Turkey, we deal with California, we've dealt with some of the smaller players around the world where we buy directly from them in large volume.
Right. Because
we can do processing, meaning pulverizing into a certain particle size or blending or packaging to their customers' needs. We work with them, so they will send us customers or send us material to process. So even though we're not the biggest company in the world, we are at the hub of the global borate market, meaning, the Turkish company is a big company. They make a good product. They have people around the world, but they tend to see things from their side of the fence.
Right.
The California company, again, big company. They make great products. Some of the South American companies, but they all seem to, they kind of know maybe what's out in the market, but it's only indirect or hearsay. Rose Mill is the only company I know that deals with most of those, if not all of them, in the course of a year or two, directly. We know who's shipping late, who's got plenty of inventory, who doesn't have any inventory. So to follow up a little bit on what we were saying about that supply-demand getting a little closer, just recently, here we are at the end of 2024.
Yep.
Things have been fairly stable since the post-COVID era. We're getting a sense of longer lead times, tighter supply, hasn't affected pricing yet. But again, you're only a disruption away, even if it's minor, from maybe changing that equation.
What do you think's behind longer lead times? It's a difficult question, I'm sorry.
Yeah. I think you have a couple of factors. The largest California company has, recently published in their SEC filings that they're getting much closer to the end of their mine life. I mean, again, they've been around for 150 something years.
Right.
And they are getting down maybe to the last decade or so of their mine life. And as you can imagine, maybe the ore quality, the amount of, they're not maybe getting as much juice out of the same squeeze that they were. The Turkish company has 5, 8, 9 years ago invested an awful lot of money into upgrading their products, their refining, but also their capacity. That's already in the market. So for either of those two companies to notably increase demand would be, again, years out. These are, huge projects with refining and mining, and takes years, and that's so everything's those are going concerns. They're already permitted. They've been operating for decades and decades. And even then, in order to make a notable change in capacity, price, purity, etc., it's a multi-year event. So there's nothing quickly that's going to happen to affect the markets.
So essentially, what you have is a slow-moving problem, which in some ways is much worse than a, it's on fire, we have to do something problem, because it's sort of almost imperceptible. So it's quite hard to persuade people to react to it or to think about it more. Is that fair?
Sure. And then you have the dynamics. What would you do if you're a multi-billion-dollar global company and one of your divisions is nearing the end of a very long run? How much money are you going to put into that? Is it you can get the return on investment for that? There are a handful of new projects around the world. There's one or two in Serbia. There's one in Nevada. There's one in California. Some of those seem to be commercially viable. The ones in Serbia have been on and off for years. How commercially viable it is, I don't know. There's only one actual permitted production new borate refining facility, and that's in California.
Right.
They've got a pilot plant up and running, so not nearly enough to affect the market, but they're about the only, is the cavalry on the horizon? Maybe. They're still in startup phase, although they've done all the heavy lifting, which is years of permitting, years of approval. California is not the most friendly place to do business with, yet they've got a lot of stuff already past the goal line there. So maybe in the coming year or so, that capacity would, help alleviate and maybe tend towards stabilization of pricing for all the reasons that we just talked about.
It sounds like the markets have a few interesting years ahead of them. I guess just on a final
transitional time. It's very transitional time.
I think everywhere. There's a lot going on, and I guess just a final point is in your role as a processor, because I'm actually guessing at this point, but that processing would be a big pinch point if you've got this.
Just so real broad picture here. So you have either traditional mining companies where you're, blowing up rocks and digging up rocks, or you have in situ mining where you're drilling a hole in the ground, you find this body of ore somewhere under there, you sink some mildly acidic water into the ground, the minerals dissolve, you bring them up to the surface. If you drive by, it's not a giant hole in the ground. You notice a bit of a refining plant, but the landscape more or less looks like it's the same. Mm-hmm. And from there, they refine these into the various, we'll call them base level refined borates. So typically you're getting salt-like crystals. If I put borax in your hand or boric acid in your hand, it would look like table salt.
Look like washing powder.
A little bit, yes.
Yeah.
So. Again, all the main companies in the world produce a good product. They all don't produce the same products. So Company A may produce one or two variations of borax, which is the sodium borate, DOT, which is used in a lot of applications, flame retardants, but also for agriculture. Those are all sodium borates. There's hydrogen borates like boric acid. There's anhydrous, meaning dried out versions, more crystalline, glassy versions, such as boric oxide or anhydrous borax. And not all the few players produce all of them. So the two main players, California and Turkey, produce most of them. Some of the smaller ones may only produce the higher moving ones like boric acid and or borax. And there's one or two kind of specialty producers that are doing super high-end nuclear grade things. And that's it globally, as we said. There's just, literally a handful of these producers. That's the materials as produced by those, let's call them mining and refining companies, account for maybe the large majority of the usage. So if you're a glass manufacturing facility, or you're making, refractory materials, or, the glass used on your Samsung TV or iPhone, you're likely buying a 1-ton sack of this table salt looking borax or boric acid or boric oxide, or maybe even getting railed in or pneumatically conveyed in large quantities. But a growing part of the market is using further refined and processed borates or elemental boron. As manufacturing gets more sophisticated, and now we're talking about specialty glasses, specialty refractory materials, pharmaceuticals, the neodymium magnets. Rosemill developed a cathode grade boric acid. It's a very fine powder of a certain purity that seems to work in some of these new EV applications. The market seems to be demanding something other than the plain Jane vanilla table salt like products as done from these producers. So the higher up the food chain and the more post-processing, let's call it, you need, the higher the pinch point might be in the supply and demand relationship. So again, the post-processed material is not the lion's share yet. But the way I would think of the borate market, like a great summary for your audience may be, the overall boron pie is growing.
Okay.
And the sliver of the pie that requires additional processing to meet all these super duper fun technological needs is growing within that growing pie.
All right.
So the pie's growing, the sliver of specialty stuff is growing. So you have, perhaps pinch points on a very broad supply-demand situation with the as-produced salt-like vanilla products, but probably a bigger pinch point as that slice of the pie of the specialty stuff grows. Just not a lot of processors out there to handle a lot of what we think is going to be. And we didn't even talk about the whole kind of onshoring, reshoring trend globally. Here in North America, there's a huge trend with the recent election here. That trend will probably accelerate. Europe would like to have a lot of their manufacturing, not just in borates, but in everything, be less dependent upon China. Geopolitical volatility seems as likely, if not more likely, going forward in the next couple of years. So the trend to bring these supply chains home and have the processing, the material touched here, value added here, wherever here happens to be, as long as it's shorter than it was pre-COVID, I think that'll be our trend.
Okay. So it sounds like the pressure is rising, but there are also plenty of solutions out there. Well, look, thank you for taking the time to give us a glimpse into these fascinating markets, and we hope you'll come back soon and tell us some more about them. In the meantime, if you've enjoyed this Fastmarkets podcast and would like to learn more about our prices and coverage, please visit our website at www.fastmarkets.com.
Thank you. Goodbye.